Assalamu alaikum. We'll continue with yesterday's topic on William Wordsworth. And looking at Wordsworth, we saw him not as a poet but as a critic. So we also saw how he was instrumental in bringing about Romanticism in England, in Britain. Um, First off, we saw the limitations of his critical work and why and the occasion which brought about the critical work in the first place. So writing this lyrical ballads, which garnered much attention and criticism from all sides, especially the neoclassical critics who attacked him for the kind of very simplistic subjects of his poetry, and he had to defend himself, because of which he included a preface in his next edition that came about some 2 years later. So what we see is it his criticism was occasioned by a necessity. Okay, and his criticism, it seems to border on hypothetical postulations than providing any practical solution, because see, it was written over a period of some 15 years. Okay, first he wrote one and then he revised it and then revised it again and added certain explanations or tried to clear some obscurities or ambiguities in his work. So gradually we see his mind forming, forming and reforming, and his ideas taking shape very, very gradually. Anyway, we saw a little bit about romantic criticism, especially the romantic movement, how it originated in the Western Europe in mid 18th century, how there were certain pioneering works written by so many romantic writers, like Rousseau and Goethe and all sorts of other writers. But we also saw that romantic movement itself was not a movement of revolution or a movement that included any wars in it. It was more a movement of thought, a movement towards nature and childhood and simplicity, genuineness, instinct, impulse. So what you see is it is a collage of ideas rather than one single idea. And all of those ideas point out to one single thought, that is of emotion. Okay, so emotion is given more is more privilege than thought or reason or logic, for that matter. So we understood a little bit of the romantic movement and how it came about, and its various consequences in terms of the French Revolution, in terms and even in the literary field, how it affected every single thing, every single artist or writer or thinker or philosopher or even politicians or the social reformers. It affected. It had an overall effect. So what we see is that each one of us has some romantic concept inside us, no matter how logically we may think, no matter how reasonable we may be. We are, or we have been affected by romanticism. So this idea cannot be reversed, it seems. So we looked into some of the key figures of romantic movement, of the French philosopher Rousseau, the Germans Schlegel brothers, the English writers William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. And yes, they not merely, they were not merely looking for bringing about romanticism in literature. They were mostly concerned with various other arenas that affected mankind. So Godwin wrote on political justice and social reform, while Mary Wollstonecraft fought for women. But all of it stemmed from the romantic idea that each person, the common man, was more important. Everyone was considered more important. The child himself became the center of the genius. So we saw a little bit about his creative work, his poetry, The Immortal Duet, Danabi Solitary Bow, all of these poems. And there were plenty more, many more poems which we do not include here, for the sole reason that it would go on for pages. Okay, but these are something that need to be mentioned. That's why they are found here. Anyway, Looking at his critical works, we saw a few of his critical works, and they are mostly like prefaces, okay? And it's a little similar to what Dryden wrote. So Dryden's work is all prefaced, right? Except for one particular work. So yeah. Then we see lyrical ballads, the seminal work of romantic poetry, and how he wrote various prefaces every time he republished it or every time he brought out an edition of it. So we see a certain appendix attached to his first preface later, and an essay supplementary much later. So there is a process, there is a ripening of his ideas in these 15 years. So what you see also is of noteworthy is the thought that every time he added something to his preface, he did so keeping in mind all the attacks that has been made over his previous preface. So he tends to answer his critics and convince the anomalies, or try to logically reason out the anomalies found in his earlier prefaces, earlier works. So this is where we stopped yesterday. Neoclassical poetic diction. So basically, what is diction? The first thought comes to anyone's mind is, what is diction? Diction would simply mean choice of words. It's very simple. Choice of words. And when we say poetic diction, what we imply is the words chosen by the poet in his poetry. All right. Now, each one has their own distinctive style, but there are some ground rules laid down by the classic writer Cicero. Okay, and Cicero divided basically language into three distinct forms based on whether they were low language, middle language, or high language. Now, low language was used to prove, while the middle was used to please, and high to move. Now, when we say move, what the intention is to move emotionally rather than physically. So Cicero believed that you need to have a very lofty or very high kind of language that is ostentatious, sometimes even, to move someone emotionally. Okay, it has to touch your heart. That kind of language ought to be used. And when we say language, it's not merely the choice of words, but the placement of words, how the words are are made to work together, like the way you play around with the words, all of it. Okay, so this is what brings about the style in a certain work. So you believe, at least I hope you believe, each one has a distinct style. Every writer has a distinct style. You look at Charles Dickens, he has a very distinct style. Whereas you go for Jane Austen, her style is entirely different. Or even, okay, you may assume that there is a gender difference, that's why their writings are so very different. But then compare Jane Austen with Charlotte Bronte, or George Eliot, or any other poet for that, or any other novelist for that matter. You would, of the same era, I'm talking about the same era. Okay, so when you compare their works, you would find that each one has a very distinct style of their own. Okay, so the same goes for poetry. Every poet has their own distinct style. For instance, Spencer, who lived around Shakespeare's time, or even a little bit before Shakespeare, he should have written in early modern English language. Okay, but then what you find is that he uses very archaic words. Okay, words that have become obsolete, that no longer hold any currency. Now, those kind of words he uses, but also you may have to look at the content of his works. The Fairy Queen, if you look at Fairy Queen, it is a very obsolete concept. It's a very archaic concept. Again, Epithalamion, the poetry he wrote for his wife, even it has all sorts of Greek allusions to it. It has some biblical allusions to it. So maybe it is quite possible that depending upon the subject of his poetry, he chose the language, he chose a certain style. But then it is obvious that his language, his style is completely different from the kind of writing Malov did. Okay, even though Malov lived around the same time, they have very distinct styles. Okay, now consider Milton during the Restoration Age. What you see is Milton's words are highly uncommon, and the phraseology that he uses, that implies, is complicated to say the least. See, he used all sorts of schemes and tropes of that were classical, classical schemes and tropes. Yeah, he used prosthesis, penthesis, syncope, ecope, or parallelisms, and plenty of antithesis, opposition, parenthesis, anastrophes, ellipsis. It list is endless. Thereby, he created a certain, he. In fact, his work is so interspersed with all sorts of Latinisms. Of course, he was a Latin clerk by day, so he had to work on it all day, and obviously, it would have crept into his writing as well. But you see, he has his own style. Milton's style is very different from the kind of writing that was prevalent during his time. Okay, now this coming back to Cicero's idea of language, as to how a certain kind of language is used to prove, certain kind of language to please, and certain kind to move. That which this three styles Cicero believes would help in rhetorics, in oratory. Now the same could be applied to writing poetry, and what you find is that the slow was more suitable for elegies, and the middle or technical for pastoral poetry, and the lofty or the high kind of language or high style for epic. So each kind of style or each kind of language for a specific genre, subgenre of poetry. So in 17th and 18th century, neoclassical writers had laid down rules with only two categories, the low and the lofty. So the neoclassical writers, what they did, they did away with the middle or the technical kind of writing. Technical because there was a Samuel Johnson who believed that there is a technical kind of language that is not at all suitable for poetry. So they dispensed away with both middle and technical kind of poetry and just kept low and lofty. Okay, so there were two kinds of languages. We are talking about languages here. Okay, languages or style or poetic diction. So only lofty remained, and both low and technical were abandoned. So during neoclassical age, they completely did away with all other forms and kept only lofty kind of poetic diction for their poetry. So a system of words at once refined from the grossness of domestic use and free from the harshness of terms appropriated to particular arts. So a certain word, a very a specific set of words or a system of words was refined as in they were purified, and all the grossness of the domestic use, as in all the the familiarity with which we have we've become over familiar with the kind of words that we use every day, right? So all that, and it seems it's gross. Okay, it's gross as in the kind of words that we use in day-to-day language, in our day-to-day communication, is not good enough. So those kind of words were filtered away. Those kind of words were taken away from the language. Okay, and free from the harshness of terms appropriated to particular arts. Now here, when we say appropriated to particular arts, we would the implication is technical language. So any kind of technical language is also taken away. Technical words are taken away. So what we are left with is a very abstract or very high kind of language that is not used in common day interactions. So it differed from prose by its happy combination of words, flowers of speech, plucked from the bramble of current forms of expression. So you see, it was merely happy combination of words for some. Okay, because see, what they intended was not the thought behind the word, but the word itself. The focus was more on words than the thought. Okay, and they were flowers of speech. You know, there is a kind of ostentatiousness about the kind of words they chose. So they were merely flowers of speech that were plucked from the bramble of current forms of expression. So it's all bramble. It's all like, drying stems and roots out there, and you are picking only the flowers. Okay, you're leaving everything that is of substance. You're leaving it aside and just picking up the beauty of it, just picking up the beautiful flowers out there, flowers of speech. Artifice, but see, it is good in a sense that we get the finest kind of writing during neoclassical age. But what happens is, at the hands of the not so competent writers, it becomes merely artifice, and it becomes artificial. So since the focus is on words alone rather than thought. See, if in the hands of people like Alexander Pope, he could turn anything into gold. He had that kind of geniusness. Okay, he was that kind of a genius. But there were other writers who were mere versifiers that were only content with writing verses. Their intention was not, their thought was not deep enough. Their philosophy was not profound. So what they ended up with was mere artificial versifying. Okay, artificial versifying as in they created verses that did not amount to anything. They were just like all right to just read. You would find pleasure with some, some rhyme or rhythm in it, but underneath there is nothing in it. Okay, so they became commonplace, like it's just commonplace when commonplace is made to look grand. I'm just hyphenated here without really explaining it. So see, the commonplace ideas were made to look grand through various poetical devices like periphrases or personification, inversion, antithesis, Latinisms, and all of those. Now, periphrases, like for example, an example is given in your book by B. Prasad. This periphrases would imply, it would imply, circumlocutory speech, as in roundabout speech. Instead of calling shepherds, you call them rural race. Instead of calling the flowers in the fields, you would call them flowery carpet, or singing birds, gay songsters of the feather train. Okay, this I can agree with. Flowers in field, flowery carpet is okay to some extent. But look at this, singing birds, becoming gay songsters of the feather train. Well, maybe out of context, it may seem weird, and within the poetry itself, it might have some significance, and it may give us some kind of pleasure. But you get my point, right? When you, instead of saying things outright, you tend to use all sorts of flowery language to, flowery or even complicated language to tell a simple thing. It is called periphrases. Now, periphrases at the hands of Pope would actually be interesting to, interesting, not only interesting, but also enjoyable. But over at the hands of an incompetent poet, that becomes tedious. Okay, what is interesting in one poet, what is interesting in the hands of a genius, becomes tedious in an inept poet. Okay, so Wordsworth pleads for the retention. Okay, so goes for personification. Again, when you personify something, you tend to give human qualities to a certain object, right? So personification to some extent is used by everyone, but overuse of any poetic device would result in a kind of caricature that would not really touch your heart. It may seem an excessive use of intelligence. Of course, when you talk to someone who is really smart, you enjoy listening to them. But if all they are doing is, if the smartness is bordering on vanity as in if they are simply showing off that they have learned something, that they are knowledgeable, don't you get irritated after a time? Well, that's what happens, because without any profound or deep truth inside, mere verbosity, mere use of what do you call it, use of excessively ostentatious words would result in a kind of substandard writing, substandard poetry, a poetry that would not touch you, that would not move you. Okay, so yeah. So, poetic diction, Wordsworth pleads for the retention of common speech. What Wordsworth does is he is asking for, please let us have common speech in poetry instead of using high sounding words, words that are very difficult to understand. As I said, Milton used very difficult words, very difficult words, phrases, Latinisms, all sorts of poetic devices. He included, I mean, see, for example, there's this word visiting, okay, visiting. He would make it visitating. Visitating. I mean, you may ask, what's the difference? There isn't any difference at all. Merely for the sake of, creating a certain complexity that would probably enhance the beauty of the verse, he works around, he plays around with words, thereby making it all the more difficult. He would include all sorts of Greek allusions, I mean, mythological allusions or biblical allusions. Okay, they are fine to some extent, but but an excessive amount of it actually complicates the study, complicates the understanding. Unless you're very well learned, unless you have a very strong grounding in Greek mythology or in Roman mythology or in in the study of Bible or or sorts of Latinisms, or even have the ability or the linguistic ability to demystify complex words. Unless you have all of these, I believe it will be very difficult to appreciate Milton. So see, it is for a select group of people. Milton's work was for us. I don't know why I keep going back to Milton, because, probably because I have found it very hard to. I mean, on the surface reading is always fine with Milton, but to actually understand in depth, it has been difficult for me. That's probably why I seem to find fault with him all the time. Okay, the fault is with me. I don't have the required scholarship to appreciate Milton, possibly. No, the point I'm trying to make here is that Wordsworth wants the kind of poetry that could be understood by and appreciated by common man. Okay? It should have retained common speech. He insists that poetry should concern itself with the eternal passions of the heart. It's the eternal passions of the heart. Instead of going to all sorts of mythologies, why not go to the core of humanity? Go to the thing that beats in everyone's chest, the heart, right? Why not, approach the passions, eternal passions of the heart? What does the heart crave for? Why go for, Adam and Eve? Why go to the paradise? Why go to the God? The God resides in everyone's heart. Go to that place and you will find that even the simplest of flowers, the simplest of bees, the simplest of shrubs or trees or myrtles, everything, every single part of nature possesses some, transcendental image of God within. So why not appeal to that part of being? So he says the principal object was to choose incidents and situations from common life. So the main purpose of his poetic diction is for him to choose incidents and situations from common life. Common life as in the day-to-day life, and here he specifically means rural life, not the urban life. Okay, there is always an ongoing struggle in Wordsworth's poetry. You would find that there is always a struggle between the city life and the country life as in rural village life. Okay, so the common life in a selection of language really used by men. Now this word really used by men has come to a great deal of disagreement and conflict, you could say, because his one-time friend Coleridge, he seems to have asked, yeah, really, you're saying language really used by men? Really, what kind of men are you talking about? Please give us a description of that men. See, as I said earlier in my previous lecture, they were very good friends, both of them, Wordsworth and Coleridge. They lived together in Grasmere for some time, and they spent a lot of time discussing poetry and style of poetry and all of that, right? But gradually they drifted apart, and a certain kind of difference of opinion originated between them, resulting in all sorts of accusations, or they especially concerning poetry, or the subject of poetry and language of poetry. So both disagreed with each other later. So later on, much later, Coleridge asks Wordsworth, really, what men are we talking about here? Now, Wordsworth, he clearly states that we are talking about men that are untouched by urbanization. Okay? Men that are untouched by the changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution. All right? So, what you see is you are looking for a kind of language that is used in common day to day interactions by people living in the country. The country would imply the village. Okay? Language of good poetry should in no respect differ from good prose. See, another claim, or another rule he lays down is that language of good poetry should not be different from good prose. So the poetry and prose should have the same kind of language. So how would you know that a poetry, which is poetry, which is prose? There are, works, there are prose works that are really poetic. I mean, when I look at like Memoirs of Geisha, or even Rebecca, they are prose pieces but are so poetic, right? So how do you distinguish when both use the same kind of language? Can poetry sound like prose? I know prose can sound like poetry and still be prose, but can poetry sound like prose and still be poetry? Well, he finds answer for this much later. But then he believes it's okay to use, no need to have a separate kind of language, as the neoclassical writers believed, a separate kind of language for poetry. He dismissed elaborate vocabulary. Elaborate vocabulary, no need for elaborate vocabulary. Whatever you have, whatever you have in your vocabulary, whatever words you have in your vocabulary, that should suffice. No need to create ostentatious vocabulary for poetry. He dismissed elaborate personification, pathetic fallacy, periphrasis, inversion, antithesis, classical mythology, conceits, hyperbole, and obscurity. All of these he used himself, but in moderation. That's the difference between, see, he may have claimed that he did not use any of it initially. He may have claimed that he wanted to do away with all of these, all of these poetic devices to make his poetry beautiful. Nevertheless, his poetry is made beautiful because of all of it. He used antithesis, he used periphrasis, he used inversions, and he did use classical mythology at times, but in moderation, in small quantities. That's the main difference between his diction and the diction of his preceding age. Though he did use them himself occasionally to great effect. So see, why he wanted, how this idea of poetic diction came about in Wordsworth. That's what we're going to see here. We've understood that he had a certain set of ideas or rules laid down for choosing the kind of words that you need to put in poetry. But how did it come about? Basically, he intended to use, to ascertain how far the language of conversation in the middle and lower classes of society was adapted to the purpose of poetic pleasure. So when he wrote lyrical ballads along with his friend Coleridge, the idea was to just experiment. Experiment, because they have been they've been reading all these poems written by their predecessors. Predecessors as in the ones who wrote before them. Looking at those poems, they wanted to have an experiment. They wanted to work out an experiment. Because of the romantic movement, a certain creed has been built. And the pre-romantics, they laid down the rules for romanticism. So they realized that it is okay to not merely cater to the ones who are educated, but even to those who are living in relative obscurity. and still focus on appealing to them. Because see, when you write for the kind of people who are well educated, only the well educated will be able to read and appreciate it. But when you write for even a farmer, everyone can appreciate it. I mean, even those who are well educated, even those who have, better knowledge, or like or more knowledgeable, can appreciate those kind of poetry. So they wanted to, experiment with the language of conversation of the middle and lower classes of society, and wanted to know if this would, you know, would suit suit to suit to poetry, and bring any kind of poetic pleasure. So choose incidents and situations from common life, and to relate or describe them throughout as far as possible in a selection of language really used by men. And at the same time, to throw with them a certain coloring of imagination whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual aspect. So you see, you need to choose incidents and situations from common life. Like, the solitary reaper. You remember the solitary reaper poem? Behold her single in the field, yon solitary highland lass, reaping and singing by herself, stop here or gently pass. Alone she cuts and binds the grain and sings a melancholy strain. Oh, listen, for the vale profound is overflowing with the sound. No nightingale did ever chaunt more welcome notes to weary bands of travellers in some shady haunt among Arabian sands. A voice so thrilling ne'er was heard in springtime from the cuckoo bird, breaking the silence of the seas among the farthest Hebrides. Will no one tell me what she sings? Perhaps the plaintive numbers flow for old, unhappy, far off things and battles long ago. Or is it some more humble lay, familiar matter of today? Some natural sorrow, loss, or pain that has been and may be again? Whate'er the theme, the maiden sang, as if her song could have no ending. I saw her singing at her work, and o'er the sickle bending. I listened, motionless and still, and as I mounted up the hill, the music in my heart I bore, long after it was heard no more. So, what did you understand was the subject of the poem? A reaper, a solitary reaper who is working in a field. Now, when she is working, the poet is passing by and he is looking at her and seeing the beauty of the majesty of the nature around her, and probably her own connection with nature. How she is connected to the nature and how she is singing, and he is almost challenging people, to any passerby, to either stay and listen to her sing, or can simply keep their mum and leave, right? So what you see is so you see, it's a very common life situation. Okay, there is nothing extravagant about it. There is nothing ostentatious about a reaper, right? And the kind of words he uses. Look at the kind of words. Okay, forget the Hebrides or the what else is there that stands out? No, he speaks of very simple words that could be understood ordinarily, and the kind of metaphors he uses. Um, like sickle bending, no, even you cannot call it sickle bending. mm, See, there is nothing very extravagant about it. See, it simply says, alone she cuts and binds the grain and sings a melancholy strain. Of course, she is cutting and binding the grain, and in the meantime she's singing a melancholy strain. Oh, listen, for the vale profound is overflowing with the sound. You see that when you are, or when, the reaper is singing, the whole valley seems to be echoing with the sound of of her music, of her song, right? And no nightingale did ever chant more welcome notes to weary bands of travelers in some shady haunt among Arabian sands. Anyone would have heard of travelers in Arabia, right? So, yeah, and well, everyone has a fair idea of how Arabia is full of deserts, and any passerby, any traveler there is going to be really weary and tired and exhausted, and listening to a nightingale sing in that place would be so refreshing for that person, would be so refreshing. So see, it is not very difficult imagery. Even the imagery is fairly simple, something that anyone can easily appreciate and understand without having to go to a dictionary or some, some Greek lexicon, right? Which would be the case with some of the more verbose poetry that were written earlier. So he chose incidents and situations from common life and to relate and describe them throughout as far as possible in a selection of language really used by men. So the language itself is simple enough. Uh, a simple question he's asking: will no one tell me what she sings? Isn't it easy to understand? It's a very simple language. Won't you tell me what she is singing? Okay, okay. So see, at the same time, to throw over them a certain coloring of imagination. Uh, Coloring of imagination, he's using certain imagination over simple language. Only then it would stand out as poetry, right? It would be simple conversation otherwise. So he says, see, perhaps the plaintive numbers flow for old, unhappy, far off things and battles long ago. Now, here, after using a very simple conversational style of asking what she is singing, will no one tell me what she sings? He goes on to add some imagination to that question, answering, giving an imaginative answer. Perhaps the plaintive numbers flow for old, unhappy, far off things and battles long ago. Yeah, he is using his imagination. Maybe she is singing for something that has been long lost, or something, some battle that has been fought very, very long ago. So simple language with an active imagination can bring about great poetry. So you don't have to resort to verbosity, whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual aspect. So the ordinary thing here would be the solitary reaper, a reaper who is all alone. It's a very ordinary thing, but when it is presented to the mind, it has an unusual aspect. It makes a very, very fine and unique picture that no one has forgotten in the last 200 years. See, he it this poem, see, it was written in 1802, okay, 1802, and it's been more than 200 years and we're still talking about it. We don't need to, but still, it makes that kind of impression. It has that kind of impact. Low and rustic life, and you also need to keep in mind that there have been so many poems of this kind, but no other poem, as far as I know, has taken up this much of appreciation from all quarters, from everywhere. Low and rustic life, free from outside influences. Okay, so basically he goes for low and rustic life, as in village life, country life, free from outside influences, as in you won't find any trains, or you won't find any vehicles out there, or any smoke, or and any industrial smoke. Yeah, chimney smoke will be there, but no industrial smoke would mar the beauty of Wordsworth's poetry. So he wants a kind of poetic diction that would be low and rustic and free from outside influences. Convey the feelings and emotions in simple and unelaborated expressions. So these kind of words would convey the feelings and emotions in simple, very simple and unelaborated, uncomplicated expressions. So he also, believed that these kind of expressions would be genuine. Okay, see, that was one of the reasons why he wanted simple and straightforward diction for his poetry, because what he felt was that when you are mourning for someone, like for instance, take an elegy. Okay, an elegy,